It's such an attractive topic, I think, for creatives because it's fundamental for creativity. You can have characters, you can have all these things, but when you start to zoom in to see what they're wearing, to see what's behind them, to see what's out their window, how many of us when we were young and creative drew entire world maps of fantasy places? Oh, this is the Bay of Kelbadar, whatever.
Right.
This is the mountain chain and I've done this hundreds of times where you make all these worlds and you name everything. And then as you get older, they start to get really advanced and you start getting very detailed and your cultures start to blend out. And it becomes almost an obsession, I would say, for creative people. And I know creatives that get lost in the world building phase. They never come out of it, which is a common pitfall, I believe, where they have journals and they love to read their like Doug, 84, and they'll read all this stuff. I'm like, man, that's great, but for what? Like, what are you going to use it for? And I think he's just using it just for play. That's his playtime, just to world build. So, and there's value in that too. But I think ultimately world building is for a purpose. For me, it has usually been role-playing world building because I usually am the dungeon master for role-playing games. And I have an open world strategy, so I like to come up with a lot. Sometimes too much. And then for writing novels, those are really the purpose for me for world building. Everything I do for world building is called into service for those two purposes.
Yeah, I am the pitfall that can happen with overly building a world is something that I definitely want to talk about because it's something that I've kind of shifted my way of thinking about that, or at least I've shifted how I world build. And so I'll talk about City of Reckoning and kind of my approach with that world and like how I've been lately with different worlds. I'll get into that more into depth, but just to kind of like start framing the conversation, the way I think about world building is it's just like it's one of those things where in the broadest possible sense, every single story actually has world building, even if you are telling a story that's set in like a modern day, small town in Vermont, whatever. You have to know what that small town in Vermont is like. Even if you're going and, if it's based off of a real place, you're still bringing in what details are important for that story. And you need to know like what the rules are of this world. Like no matter how small it is. I have one thing that I'm working on that is set in a cult and it's like very small. It's a Huron's Labyrinth story, I realized. And it's very small and isolated in terms of like the scope of where we move geographically in that story, but world building is still coming in because I need to figure out, okay, what is this cult? How does it operate? What are the cultural elements of it? What are the rules? And so no matter what kind of story you're telling, no matter how much it's based in real life or whether it's, a complete fantastical, imaginary world, you always are figuring out what are the rules of this setting and how does that impact the story? Maybe that's like the broadest possible way of thinking about world building as far as I'm concerned so far. As I've thought about it, where it's just like you need to know how your characters are interacting with this environment, how that environment is enhancing the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah, I actually have devised some strategies to help me zoom in to what is the most pertinent. Again, the friend that loves to world build and only world build, part of his problem is that he can't figure out a single story. And then when he does try to zoom in on a story, he tries to include characters from every single corner of his globe that he's. And I'm like, no. It's really best to save that and figure out the beauty and the dynamics of just your first setting. If you can establish that first setting and make people can't wait to turn the page because their imaginations are filling up with things they've never seen before with your words, then you've got them. And now you can expand on to the next thing. In fact, I love the idea of building out that first scene and hooking people in it and then slowly building out. And then before you know it, if you've done a good job, there's an entire world, not in your head, just in your head, but in everyone who's read your book, they're a part of it now and it's in there. And then you can move pieces around and people around inside that universe.
What you just said about like starting small and building out, that was very much how I tried to approach with City of Reckoning. Because that's like, if you have a world that's very big and complex, like you have to do that. Like that's because you don't want people to feel overwhelmed and you want them to be interested. You want them to know more. And so it's like starting with another thing that I think I could have done better in that book that I've grown a bit since then is just like really focusing on what is it that. So this is assuming you've made like a more complicated world. Like you need to focus on what is it that your readers or your viewers need to know at that moment, and like you reveal the information they need for the story right before they need it. Not anytime sooner, because if it's anytime sooner, it feels like info dumping. And it has to be, again, what is actually relevant to the story. So if you've developed all this history and stuff, like nobody cares. Like that's the harsh truth. Literally nobody cares. And it's great that you have built that. Potentially, we'll go back to that subject in a minute. But like at the end of the day, what you're doing right now when you're telling a story is you're telling a story. And so that's what you have to remember, is that like you want people to be interested in your world. And hopefully if they've enjoyed the story enough and they've enjoyed the characters, then you can have that other information like for the extreme fans, that want to know all the other stuff. And then it's there. But yeah, I love that idea about like, all right, let's start with a small, intimate part of this, like right here, and we'll just kind of, radiate out a little bit. And then you can tell that there's more out there, but we don't need to show you all that. You just need to know, you just need to see what's relevant for the story.
Well, and in my thinking too, it's like, if you can't sell me in a single setting that you have thought this out, then you really have no business in building out the rest of that world yet, because I call it where the rubber meets the road. That's how I tell myself. Because sometimes, you know how it is, Brianna and Heath, I'm sure you too, where you have this enormity of details and broad like universe. And then it's really hard to zoom into a single room, a single setting with this character and only that character, and all that other stuff goes away. That's where the rubber meets the road from all the grandiose, vivid imagination, world building you've done. You have to be able to zoom into that where the rubber meets the road, and then sell me that sell me that you can write something compelling there. Because, and when I say sell me, I mean to myself even, like, Doug, you have to sell that, your audience, that you can build out this one setting. So very important. And that rubber meets the road gets tricky, because the broad strokes, like I'm sure somebody either in the chat or Heath and Brianna, you have read both Game of Thrones and the Song of Fire and Ice, which is like George R.R. Martin's Silmarillion. And that reads like a history book. So a lot of times when you're doing world building, it's got this history book sound to it. And then you got to shift over and you got characters there. And suddenly it's like, but this is the era of iron. That means nothing, to this room. How does that work in this room? So it gets tricky to cross that bridge.
Well, that goes to a point that I know that I hit in another stream. And actually somebody commented on that stream a while back ago that was like, I love it. Heath says, not to belabor the point after belaboring the point for 2.5 hours. So it may have been this point that history is not story. And so when we start developing the world and you're doing the world building, you can get very detailed with the history and all that and what happens in this world. I know because I've done it, and that is all great, but it's so important to remember that history that you're writing is not the story. Once you've got all that laid out, it's then your job as a separate issue, and that's why I'm separating world building from the story construction, is then to look at all that you have and go, where is the story? Now, where is the story in all of this?
So I don't necessarily separate them. I do think that world building is part of it. However, that's why I added that distinction, purpose. It's important for you, the creative, to define the purpose of your world building. If it's just to have fun and build out a world for your own imagination, then have at it. If it's to write a story, then you have to keep that purpose in mind.
Well, let me tell you what I mean by separating them. Because my goal has been to develop two worlds: the Tales of Rabavania and Theophany. Okay, so what does that mean to do these worlds? Like, what does that mean? So that's a question that you've got to answer. And it could mean to do a story. It could mean to do a movie. It could, a novel. It could mean to do a movie. It could mean to do an RPG campaign setting. It could mean a lot of things. It could mean to do a YouTube channel. Like, what does that mean? So I realized that I was conflating all of my world building with the story. And so what I need to do was completely separate those things. So that I can do. I've written a 5,000 word RPG world primer for Rabavania. It's just world building, and it's James has edited it, so it's going to be coming out next year. So if you just want the world building because you want a setting to play a game, I can just lean into all of the world building. I don't have to worry about the story. It's the setting right as the story is going to start that I'm writing. But here's all of that, and I just put all of that, and I can go into as much detail about their nobility, the hierarchy of their nobility, whatever their religions, whatever I want, because people are expecting that in an RPG book. And that's just a separate task that goes into that book. And then it's time to just mentally switch and go, now it's story time.
Yeah. In fact, one little exercise I've done that has helped is when I'm trying to transition from the broad strokes world building to rubber meeting the road, is I just start having characters talk. I'll just start writing scenes with dialogue where characters are going back. It's specifically where they're explaining something about the world to other characters. So what happens is it goes from me to characterize, a character from that era. Maybe they're sitting at a tavern next to a guy at the bar, and he's explaining something that this guy doesn't understand. So he's explaining it in his word. That little exercise has helped me out. It gets me into a scene and out of my intellectual brain. And it's funny too, because I did that for the current book I'm writing, Empress Theodora book 2, and I didn't use any of it. I did it, and it was a bridge only, but it got me there.